Hello everybody! Welcome to More Chainsaws Needed, where, because I love horror, thrillers and suspense, I am going to talk, rant, rave about, review and recommend movies, TV series and books in those genres for you guys as I draw. I made a quick poll on my Facebook page, link on my link tree and description, about this one, and well, what do you know? Classic horror movies won again. But you can change the topic next time if you follow me there. So anyway, with a classic movie in mind, I decided to pick one of horror cinema pillars that has been so influential that there are even now people who are terrified of showers, violins, and people with overt emotional attachment to their mothers, and some of them haven't even watched the movie. I am talking about Psycho, a movie that, at its time, was so shocking that cinemas had posters outside warning people about spoiling the movie to others. Don't reveal the ending, it's the only one we have. And director Alfred Hitchcock went and bought as many copies of the book as he could, specifically to make sure that people could not read it before watching the movie, and thus went and spoiled it into the theaters. Which, let's be honest, is something that would not happen today. I know that there will be some trying their hardest to spoil every single detail of the movie, director wishes be damned. Besides that, among the many things created to this little movie that could, seriously, the studio didn't want anything to do with it, so Hitchcock actually paid out of his pocket for the production and took advantage of the fact that he had access to a studio as he was filming a completely different thing for his TV show at the same time. The things that we can count are the origins of the slasher genre, even if the actual rules of it wouldn't come until much later, lowering the bar for what was acceptable to show in a movie with regards to violence and sexual content. In fact, it had the first showing ever of a toilet in a movie, doing not one but two twists in the movie, and the weird situation that, while originally the no spoiler policy worked and people didn't reveal the ending, now it's one of the most known endings of whole horror history, again, even known to people who have never seen the movie, as it has been referenced, copied, parodied, and analyzed to hell and back. Now, you may be thinking, why am I going to add to the pile of people talking about Psycho? Well, I hope you stay with me, as I think I have something a little bit new to say. Psycho is one of horror's seminal movies, directed and produced by Alfred Hitchcock and released in 1960. The plot is now well known. Marion, a young woman who wishes nothing more than to marry her lover, Sam Loomis, decided to steal $40,000 from her boss and go in the run, ready to use that money to fulfill her dreams. However, as she gets more and more paranoid of cops following her around, she stops at a motel off the main highway, the unassuming Bates Motel, ready to spend the night there. After an amiable but strange dinner with the motel owner, Norman, she decides to return the money. But before she does that, she goes on to take the most infamous shower of all of movie history. And then, spoilers. That you probably know because, seriously, despite Hitchcock being successful in making sure that the original audiences went unspoiled, including forbidding anyone from entering the theater once the movie had started, something that is now common practice, there are now the most known twist on horror movie history, to the point that some DVD covers have both big moments of them. Hitchcock may be rolling on his grave about that one if he is not already rolling, because every single trailer spoils everything nowadays. Anyway, the movie is based on the book by the same name, written by Robert Bloch. And here's where we take our first small detour, because you are going to love hearing about him. See, Robert Bloch may not ring a bell for general audiences now, but back in the 50s, he was one of the biggest names on horror and true crime fiction, and a protege of none other than H.P. Lovecraft. Just imagine how talented young Bloch must have been so that famous people hater Lovecraft would actually like him, want to write to him, and introduce him to his friends. Psycho was, in fact, his sixth novel, although he had written a little less than 100 short stories and essays and was published in 1959. And here's where the story gets a bit spotty. A lot of people think that Norman Bates was based directly on serial grave robber and possible serial killer Ed Gein. And we will talk a little bit more about him in a bit, as you can imagine from this video's title. But the truth is far more complicated, and now there are even conflicted stories as to how the connection came to be. It is true that Bloch was always fascinated by true crime. In 1943, he wrote a story about Jack the Ripper that, while it was still considered a fantastic story because the Ripper was immortal in that story, it still was more factual than other fictional takes on the famous killer, even to this day. In 1945, he continued this with Iron Mask, about, well, the man in the Iron Mask, The School of the Marquis de Sade, about, yes, you can imagine, and the next year, 1946, Lizzie Borden Took an Axe, which helped popularize even more the case of Miss Borden and her family. Much later, he'd also write a novel about H.H. Holmes titled American Gothic. By the way, if you think that this was the only time Bloch talked about the Ripper, you'd be very wrong. Besides about 5 more stories about him, Bloch also wrote a novel titled Night of the Ripper, and also Wolf in the Fold, a legendary episode of the original Star Trek second season. Talk about rich. So yeah, it's not a hard guess that a man interested in true crime and horrible murderers would get interested in a case that was solved in 1957 and then write a highly fictionalized version of what he thought had happened that would get published in 1959. But Mr. Bloch also had other interests in his fiction, namely multiple personalities. Before Norman Bates was even a glimpse in his eyes, even before Ed Gein started his path of horror, Robert Bloch wrote Lucy Comes to Town in 1952, a story about a woman who is saved by her friend Lucy from her abusive husband, but we never see Lucy. Then, in 1957, just as Gein was getting caught, he also published The Real Bad Friend, which has a lot more in common with Psycho than Lucy, as it tells a story about a dull man who, at the suggestion of a friend whom no one ever has seen or met, decides to kill his wife. So yeah, we can tell that Mr. Bloch had a lot of other ways to get to Norman Bates and his mother before Gein ever got in the picture. But since Gein existed, and was also captured before Psycho was written, and Bloch only lived 56 kilometers, about 35 miles or so, away from Plainfield, where the crimes happened, well, connections were made. And here, we must make another turn to talk a little bit about Ed Gein, since, well, he's important not only to this particular story, but also to other future fictional serial killers. The Butcher of Plainfield, as he was called by the press in 1957 when he was captured, was only charged with 2 murders and 9 charges of grave robbing. But people suspected back then that he had killed at least 4 more people, including his own brother. And well, he claimed originally that he had robbed no less than 40 graves before the trial, where he changed his story to only the 9 he was charged with. And because of the way in which he was found, well, he inspired about 4 movies on his life, plus very famous fictional serial killers like Leatherface, Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs, and, allegedly, our subject for today, Norman Bates. Gein was born in 1996 to Augusta and George Gein, and was the second of 2 boys. Augusta was, according to every single person who ever knew her, a very stern woman, quite religious to the point of fanatism, and tried to keep her sons as far away from earthly temptations as she could. She also hated women with a passion and thought every single one of them, including herself, were horrible, 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 horrible sinners. While all accounts say that Henry was somewhat social, reliable, and honest, Ed was always considered a little strange as he tended to listen to his mother more. In 1940, their father, George, died from a heart attack, and from then on, it was Henry, Ed, and Augusta all alone in their insulated farm, away from town. It's known that Henry worried a lot about his brother's attachment to Augusta and that he was planning to move away from the farm to live with a woman who already had 2 children, which I am sure Augusta loved, and tried to convince Ed to do the same, and that Ed did not react well to that. So in 1944, when Ed reported his brother missing after a fire got out of control at their property, some people talked. Especially when Henry was found dead, and the coroner said that he had died from asphyxiation, but he had some wounds in his head, as if he had been hit. So there was always that nagging suspicion in town that police had overlooked something. But Ed was still liked in town, everybody thought he loved his brother, and he also would babysit for his neighbor. So officially Henry's death was ruled an accident, and life went on for the Geins because Ed had nothing really to gain from Henry's death. A year later, Augusta died also from a heart attack, and now Ed was all alone. We don't really know what happened in the farm from then until Seth's arrest a little more than 10 years later. But we can imagine things got really weird really fast. Because in November 16 of 1957, Ed Gein was interrogated about the disappearance of the hardware store owner and deputy sheriff's mother, very important, Bernice Warden. There was a ton of evidence that Gein had been the last one to see her, and given that her son had come to the store to find it robbed and with bloodstains all over, well, he was the deputy sheriff. He was not going to just stay idle when there was a handy suspect right there. So, with Gein under custody, they went on to search his farm. They found Bernice all right. They found her quite quickly in a shed in the property, dressed out like a deer, according to the police report, which back then meant hung upside down, probably with her head cut off, and in a general nightmarish way. But if that had been all, we wouldn't be talking about Gein, and you'd be wondering what the heck has all to this to do with Norman. But the thing is, Bernice was not the only body they found right away, even if she was the most intact one. Gein House was a veritable house of horrors. I'm not going to list everything they found, but let's just say that he was a very good believer in waste not, as he used about every single possible part of the human body in the most bizarre crafts possible, from baskets to furniture to, infamously, a corset made from a woman's torso, a belt made of woman's nipples, and the most intimate parts of women collected in a box. In his confession later, Gein said that he wanted to create a woman's suit so that he could become his mother and crawl into her skin. Which, well, yeah. Not surprisingly, Gein was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and while originally was found incompetent to stand trial, a few years into treatment, he was finally tried and found guilty of one murder. Not because the court didn't think that he had been responsible for more, but because the cost of trying him for every single one was too high, and Gein was going to spend the rest of his life in a hospital for the criminal insane anyway, so why bother? The American justice. Now that we know more about Ed Gein, you guys know why people would think that Norman Bates is based on him, right? I mean, we're talking about an odd, introvert man who lived far away from any town and was completely devoted to his mother, who died, leaving him even more alone, with obvious mental issues that would develop into a full and sick obsession with the mother figure. And, well, with a particular taste for taxidermy and subjects that should never be stuffed and put on display. As I pointed out, yes, Bloch lived relatively close to Gin. But you have to understand that back then, news traveled quite slowly compared to today. And even people in Plainfield didn't know about Gaines' activities until the last murder, so it was very possible that a man living miles away wouldn't know either. Before anyone even knew what Gin was doing in the graveyards, let alone suspect him of people going missing, Bloch was already writing about a man who could be a deadly killer undetected in a small town, despite that small towns are, by nature, a gossip mill where everybody knows everything about their neighbors. It was a subject matter that fascinated him, and Norman Bates was the culmination of all his investigation on the situation. By the time he finished the first draft, Gin had been arrested and his personal collection of weird furniture was discovered. Because of this, and probably amused by the similarities between Bates' love of taxidermy and Gaines' similar love for arts and craft with forbidden materials, Bloch added a small line that sort of kinda maybe could be about Gin when people are discussing Bates' possible motives. And he left it at that because, well, there were other novels to be written. Until the full news about Gaines' mental state came out. His isolated living, his devotion to his mother, and, well, how much he wanted to be his mother. That was when Bloch was shocked to, and I quote, discover how closely the imaginary character I had created resembled the real Ed Gein, both in overt act and apparent motivation. This was even more stark for those who had only read the novel, like the 10 people who managed to get a copy before Hitchcock went on his spoiler avoidance phase, because the way in which Norman is described, fat, balding, more than a little creepy and hating humanity in general, is closer to Gein than to Perkins' interpretation of the role. As to why Bloch was so close to Gaines' personality and life? Simple. We have to remember that the man was obsessed with serial killers and had done a lot of research on the subject of mental illnesses. While of course he made some mistakes, and probably without knowing helped to cement the horrible stereotype of the man dressing as a woman to commit crimes, and we will talk about that in another occasion, because he was still working with the 50s knowledge and understanding of those subjects. But he still knew his trade. Unlike some modern writers who, say, will put the recipe for a healing potion in Zelda in a historical factual novel, because apparently Googling is hard, Bloch did his work and made sure that everything he put to paper was as close as possible to reality. Which is why, without really meaning to, he managed to write a very close novelization to what Gein did. Not that he later didn't write about Gein. I mean, in his essay, The Shambles of Ed Gein, he points out that while he heard rumors about the goal of Plainfield, the reason why he wrote his novel was more the fact that, and I quote again, men like Edward Gein can be found anywhere in the world. Quiet little men living quiet little lives, smiling their quiet little smiles and dreaming their quiet little dreams. Which, frankly, is more terrifying than anything Bloch, Lovecraft, or Hitchcock could show us. Once again, I want to urge you guys to both watch and read Psycho. I know I talk a little about the movie itself here, because again, come on guys, everyone has talked about the masterpiece that Psycho is, and I wanted to give you something different. But that doesn't mean that it didn't start from a place of love for it. A perfect example of old but not obsolete, if I might cite a far, far worse movie than Psycho, just to stay away from the remake. Gus Van Sant made a shot-by-shot recreation that could be fun if it was, say, a student film, and I can't fault his motives for making it as he did to ensure that no one else would try it again and would leave the Hitchcock original alone. But still, it's bad. Very, 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 very bad. I haven't seen the Bates Motel series or the second, third, and fourth movies, so I can vouch for those. But also, seriously, read the book. The original, not the sequel, also by Bloch. It's a completely different trip from the movie, even if both end up in the same destination. And then come back and tell me what you thought. I want to thank my dear Patreons, Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, and Jessic, as well as my first supporter, Tanya Pineda, and the most amazing woman in the universe, Amy Sunk, without whom none of my videos would be possible. I also want to remind you that if you want to support these and my other projects and get your names mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/Adelisa, written link on description with my link tree, as I know my name can be hard to spell, and with just $1 a month, you will always be thanked in my videos, as well to get access to a ton of art before anyone else, and get the chance to suggest future subjects for videos. If Patreon is a little bit too much of a commitment for you, you can also invite me a coffee at my coffee, also on the link tree, and then you will get mentioned in one video for each time you do so. If you can't support me this way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channels, comments so that the algorithm catches engagement, and of course, you sharing the links. I also welcome all your questions, feedback, and suggestions in the comments below. This was Adelisa Zarate, and remember, there is not a problem in the horror genre that can't be solved with more chainsaws.